Welcome to another morning episode of Liberty Dad Podcast, a discussion on politics and culture. Tuning in live, I especially thank you for giving me your time so early. Being anti war means being on the receiving end of quite a lot of criticism. It's always good to have a few rebuttals in your back pocket for such a time as this. And that time is unfortunately once again upon us. All right. So this morning, I want to discuss defending the anti war position. And I don't think it's actually nearly as difficult as many people might think, because once we get into some of these arguments, I think you'll start seeing, the ultimately when you're arguing a position, I like to take things and make them as simple as possible. And then I like to keep bringing it back to one or two points. And when you stay on those points, I think that you tend to find out one of two things. Either you can defend the position because it's a good position, or maybe you can't because you don't know it that well, or maybe it's really not that good of a position in the first place. So, what we're going to do is we're just going to walk through some arguments that I've been seeing that people throw at the anti-war crowd. Now, the first thing to do is to understand your own position first. You might remember in one of my previous episodes where I talked about a martial art instructor who said, if you know the basics, then you can defeat an opponent that happens to have, a lot of fancy moves. And that's absolutely true. And it's also true when you're debating and you're arguing. Because one of the things that you should probably start doing is just observe arguments and just kind of watch how they flow. And you'll notice that what ends up happening throughout the conversation is that it deviates from the original point. And when it deviates, then it becomes basically just this never ending back and forth of words. It's not that if you have the basics that you'll always win an argument necessarily. All you want to really do is focus on having the defensible position and then being able to communicate that defensible position easily and understand exactly how it fits in with the arguments being sent your way. So I think, just and we're not talking about no formal debates. We're just simply talking about, hey, when you're out with friends and somebody brings up, the war that's happening in Israel, or, between Israel and Hamas, or if they happen to even remember the war in Ukraine, which people have probably already pretty much forgotten by now. Like these things come up, these conversations come up, and you want to leave somebody with something to think about. So my anti-war position, just to kind of clarify once again, is first, self-defense is always permitted. I always, I think, I'm not sure that I like the term anti-war, because I think what people there's a lot of quite often people will walk away with their own understanding, which does not match my understanding. And so I think I've come to the position where I don't really like the term anti-war, because it leads people to believe that under no circumstance do I support any kind of war, self defense, any of that. And it's not entirely true. My position is one that self defense is always permitted, and that intentional or indiscriminate killing of innocents, civilians, is not acceptable. So one innocent civilian, or we'll just say one innocent person, one innocent, one civilian is one too many. Period. That's kind of like the North Star. That's what I aim for. And I never ever lose sight of that, no matter what. Now that doesn't mean that no innocent civilians will die. It's the approach, the attitude that really matters. Because think about it this way, there is a difference between bombing a building that Intel says is only a military target and only has military personnel versus bombing a building that you know has civilians, right? And there are, I would imagine that there are absolutely times where all the intel in the world says this has only military, this is only a military target. There are no civilians, and then you find out later there actually was. There is a huge difference in that, but quite often the arguments that people put out in favor of conflict, in favor of war, disregard civilians. Like, and I'm sure you, I mean, if you've been on social media, if you've been hearing the rhetoric between over the conflict between Israel and Hamas, a lot of people are just like, yeah, well, war is hell. It happens. Innocent people die. No big deal. And it's like, well, wait a minute. Like, you wouldn't you wouldn't hold that position if it were you that was being killed, right? Like this is the reality. So I think people just become it is my position that most people do not value life nearly as much as they like to think they would. I think it kind of be is illustrated in this in this moral dilemma that oddly enough, Dennis Prager of PragerU has reported asking people. So what he would do for many, many years is he would go out and he would ask this moral dilemma question and then report back on the results that he got. And his question was, if your dog was drowning and a stranger, same in in this body of water, if they're both drowning at the same time, which one would you save? And his results have been consistently split into thirds. One third say, well, I would save the dog, my dog, it's a personal dog. And then one third would say, I would save the stranger, and then one third are unsure. And then he points out that two-thirds of the people that he has asked over many decades have always basically been, unwilling to say that I need to save the human first. And I feel like this kind of matches. Like I've asked that same question to people, and I get roughly the same results. And so it's very interesting. And I think that this kind of highlights this, this pro-war attitude, because pro-war attitudes tend to be very pro-war. They tend to be very pro-war in all these arguments, largely, in my opinion, because they're happening somewhere else. And the question that is presented is, would in this hypothetical, what would you do? And so it's somewhere else. It's a time somewhere else. It's not a present thing that I have to physically look at. Because some of my friends have pointed out, they're like, well, DL, in that scenario, people might say one thing, but if they were actually faced with it, a lot of people might freeze. Like that presents an entirely different problem. And then some people who might have otherwise said they weren't sure or they would save the dog, they might actually change their mind in the actual moment. And I think that's absolutely true. But I still believe that there is a certain reality to what people are saying. And even though not all of them may end up, it's kind of like the guy who says, why, if there was an active threat, this is what I would do. And maybe he would, and maybe he wouldn't, right? Everybody wants to be a tough guy until things pop off. But I think that I think this does indicate where we are as a society, in that um, we are willing to at least consider certain ideas that may not match what we would actually do, because I think maybe in the moment we actually have a little bit more heart. But anyway, let's move on. I don't want to hammer on that too long. Um, so my anti-war positions, again, self-defense always permitted. Intentional or indiscriminate killing of innocents is not acceptable, and that's kind of the core of my anti-war position. Is it's really all about civilians, and then we should always seek peace or leave the door open for it. And the reason, again, is because there are innocent lives that are being taken, and they get taken on both sides. So it doesn't matter who the participants are in the war, there are likely innocent people on both sides who have not harmed anybody, who are not an active threat, and therefore they don't deserve to be killed. That is So again, this is all about civilians or innocent life. Now, a lot of the arguments today that I'm going to walk through some of these arguments are specific to the Israel Hamas conflict. But you can just simply adapt them for the next one that rolls around because there will probably be another one. And so you just want to be prepared for it. Now, again, Israel, like everyone, has the right to self-defense. And a lot of people that's a common thing that people will go, "Oh, well, you don't think they should be able to defend themselves?" I do. It's the matter of how. That is the question. It's not the what, the how. I do not oppose them targeting and killing Hamas. Hamas is the one that attacked them. So attack them back. I do oppose knowingly killing innocent civilians to get to Hamas, which tends to be the reason for most of the debates that we're seeing right now. Um, I insist that these two, for the purposes, we'll call it countries. I insist that two countries, two parties, if you will, who are at war should always seek to end bloodshed. Always. Because why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you want to seek to end unnecessary death? That's crazy. Um, Let me give you an observation. I went to Bosnia in 2002. Now, that was just shy of a decade after the war had ended, right? So the war ended in 1995. And when I went in 2002, early 2002, it was known that that Bosnia had the most potentially active landmines of any country in the world. And they estimated that there were about 9 million landmines throughout the country. Like, that was almost a decade later. Like, think about how bad a war has to be that a decade later, you've got potentially 9, somewhere up in the area of 9 million landmines. And when I was there was still a lot of war-torn country. Yeah, like, I literally saw buildings with giant holes in them. It was just intense. And now things were peaceful when I went. So it's not like it was there weren't one-offs here and there. It was completely peaceful. Like, other than the war-torn buildings and the militaries that were engaging in this post-war force. It was like a force of what they call it. We called it drawing a blank on the term, but basically you had a bunch of countries that were coming in. It was a show of force to say, all right, look, if things pop off, we're going to be here and we're going to stop it. We're going to put the hammer down right away. So don't even start. So that's what we were doing there. And, almost a decade later, without the visual of the military, without the knowledge of 9 million landmines, and without the war torn country that you could visibly see, it otherwise, which sounds kind of weird, but it otherwise appeared to be a relatively normal. Like, people got up in the morning, they went to their jobs, kids were outside playing, like all these things that you would expect in a country that has not had war or not had war in a significant amount of time. These things were happening. But still, you could see the remnants of war from almost a decade earlier. So that really had an impression upon me. And at the time, because I was a young guy. I was a young soldier with the U.S. military, and at the time, I was very much a conservative. Hey, we've got to police the world. We got to take freedom to these other people. So I was there. I'm just not there now because my personal experiences and then observations of the world around me have led me somewhere different. I think it's important that you also understand the criticism that's being leveled at you. A lot of times when we argue, you've got to focus on what is being said, not what isn't. So let me give you a really simple example. And I love using this example in terms of communication, right? Imagine a husband is, a wife is upset with her husband and she says, "You never take me out to dinner anymore." And he's like, "What are you talking about? I went out last Thursday." Right. So he's focusing on the absolute specifics of what she has said. Like, you never do this. Right. This is why absolutes are generally a bad idea. And ultimately what she's really trying to communicate is you do it so frequently that it might as well be never. And so I think we have to take some time to understand the criticism. Where is it coming from? Maybe somebody is saying something that's a little different than what the words that are coming out of their mouth are saying. And so sometimes you need a little discernment. And then once you understand that, you can bring it back to an anti-war position. And again, mine, the foundation is that innocent lives matter, right? I mean, I know we're not supposed to say, we're not supposed to say, kind of say anything other than Black lives matter, but innocent lives matter. And it doesn't matter whose life they are, what side they belong on. All right, so let's get into some of these arguments. I didn't put them. I was trying to think of a good order. And I just, as I thought of them, as I was noticing them on, social media, I just kind of put them down. So there's no particular order here. Hopefully that it still makes sense. So long time, or I'm sorry, long history, too complex. I see this one a lot. I saw an interesting one, and I wish I could remember where I saw, but it was on Twitter, and I couldn't find the particular post. But somebody was like, I think it was in response to a post that said, okay, well, once upon a time, the land of Israel was actually known as Palestine. Now, we're not going to get into that argument, but then somebody got down and they were like, well, and before that, and before this, and before this, and before this, and before this. And so they were like going through this whole history, like all the way back to like the Bible times. And, but the ultimate thing is that doesn't matter. It's just a rabbit hole. Like that's good to know. It's good knowledge, but the idea that there's a long history or that's just too complex, all that does is it just people can be complex. The morality of a response, much less. And again, this doesn't explain why it would be okay to kill civilians, which is generally the big argument when it comes to being anti-war. Like the arguments that I have had have always been, hey, innocent lives are being killed. Well, this is why it's okay, right? Like this is the moral explanation for it. And one of those moral explanations happens to be, well, it's really complex, or you just don't understand the history. And I'm like, I don't really need to understand the history to understand that the killing of an innocent person is unacceptable. There is no level of history that says it is okay to kill an innocent person. And it doesn't matter whether it's a war between two countries, or if it's the Bloods and the Crips who are warring with each other and they're shooting each other and they're doing a drive-by. One is doing a drive-by shooting on the house of another and kills a whole bunch of innocent people in the house. It doesn't make it acceptable then. It's not acceptable in a time of war. Killing innocent people is simply unacceptable, especially when it's on purpose or knowingly, right? So it's kind of a dismissive answer, but I think if somebody wants to say, well, you need to understand the history of this, then I say, fine, you need to explain to me why this complexity or why this level of history is makes it acceptable to kill an innocent person. Because if you're gonna come back at me and tell me that my position is wrong for wanting to prevent innocent civilians from being killed, then you need to explain why, right? Like you can't just say, "Oh, it's just a long history." Oh, there's too complex. You just don't understand. Like that's every bit as dismissive of my position as it would be me saying, "Yeah, long history doesn't matter. Complexity doesn't matter." Right. And so, it's fine to say that, but you want to make sure to go further and say, but if you believe it so, then you need to explain why, because they're coming to me and they're criticizing my argument. And they're saying, like, hey, look, you don't understand. Okay, well, if I don't understand, then help me understand. Help me understand why more knowledge of the history makes it okay to kill civilians, why the complexity of the situation makes it okay to kill civilians. All right, let's move on. This one was really, really popular. This one really got people going. The other side did this horrible thing. Okay, so it started out. So if you remember, um, Hamas like basically paraglided in and ended up killing like a whole town or so, like 1,300 people. I think it was 1,300 people. I don't remember the specific number, but they killed a lot of people. Right. So initially, it was just they killed a lot of innocent civilians. That was the initial. That was the initial horrible thing, and it was. It was a very horrible thing. Hamas was absolutely morally wrong. They were totally. It was atrocious. Okay, it was disgusting. Like there's no two ways about this. It was disgusting. Um, so they did this horrible thing. So therefore, we can attack back. And I say, yes, you can go and attack Hamas. Yes, you can take out, like their command center. You can take out, things that they're being used, that, like inanimate objects, right? A building, a truck, a car, whatever, those kind of things. Like, absolutely. Again, this goes back to, can you defend yourself? Yes, you can. Okay. But the thing that we have to remember about when someone says, well, they did this horrible thing, first and foremost, sometimes it's war propaganda. That does happen. Sometimes it's bad information. And as we should have learned here in the US, whenever there's an immediate tragedy, all the news that comes out in the first like 24 hours, 36 hours, it like a lot of it tends to be wrong. Like, people are trying to report, they're reporting on information as they're learning it. And then as they go along, they learn, oh, okay, the original thing that I thought was true turned out not to be true. Right. Like, somebody's like, oh man, there were six assailants, and it turned out there was only like three. Right. So there's a lot of information that comes out that's just simply bad. There's also war propaganda. Now, why would there be war propaganda? Well, if you are taking the position that it's okay to kill innocent people, you've got to get the other people on your side. And you need them to be in a position where they're going to accept the loss of innocent lives. Virtually nobody, well, I don't want to say nobody, um, no rational person, let's put it that way. No rational person is saying, no, you can't go and kill Hamas. Like, no, like like, I don't know any anti-war person that's saying that. I do know anti-war people, all of them, who are saying, do not kill innocent lives and seek to end this as quickly as possible. But the biggest problem with, oh, they did this horrible thing, is, again, it's a matter of war crimes do not justify war crimes. If it's wrong for side A to initiate violence by killing innocent people, then it's wrong for side B to retaliate and kill innocent people. Both should be considered a war crime. It should not be considered a war crime only because they started it. It has to apply to both sides. Otherwise, you're simply justifying why it's okay for one side to do something, but not the other side. Here's one that was sent to me. And I've seen this. We're not dealing with humans. Like, I've seen something along that line, like they're animals, they're monsters, they're subhuman, whatever. That is also part of war propaganda, because it makes it easier for a population to stomach death when they can detach the people that are being killed from being human in the first place. And we do this naturally. If we hear about a man who's killed, a whole bunch of children, did something very terrible to him, like, virtually everybody is disgusted, and they no longer see this person as a human. Like, this is the natural thing. But to make the argument in a time of war, and what they're really saying is that they're too vicious. I mean, some people might actually believe that they're not human, but what they're really saying is, like, they're too vicious. But to make it in a time of war, that kind of rhetoric becomes very dangerous, because it goes back to the point that I just made about this horrible thing. It opens the door for justifying more atrocities. And if you think about it, we're having that debate right now. There are people openly calling, and they're saying, make Gaza a parking lot, level the whole thing. And it's atrocious. Like, why would we not consider that to be a war crime? And I know a lot of people make the argument, they'll say, well, they voted for this, but that's not true. Right? Like, we don't need to go back through a huge amount of history, but sometimes history does have a value. I mean, you don't want to say, well, there's a long history and you need to know 30, 40, 50 years of history. You don't need to know that. Not to say that innocent lives should not be taken, but sometimes the history does matter a little bit, especially when it's relatively recent. So people say, like, well, they voted for this. Well, the truth is that in 2006, Hamas was voted in, and they were voted in with 44, like 44, 45% of the vote. and they were able to gain majority of the seats. Now I'm not sure how that actually worked out, but that's what happened, right? So 40 some percent, like not even half of the people that were voting, and that doesn't even like again, think about it this way. In the US, not everybody even votes. Okay. Some people look and say, I'm not these choices are terrible. I'm not even voting. So it was only 44% of the people that actually voted. So I don't know how much of the percent of the adult population that could vote it actually turns out to be, but it was 44%. And then they got like 72 seats, which was a majority of the seats. So that was in 2006. And then once, maybe twice, I can't remember exactly, once, maybe twice, Hamas, who had the majority of the seats, delayed future elections. So now the people are in a position where they've not even got to revote. So that argument doesn't even make sense. Now I wouldn't support it anyway, unless you had literally 100% of the population that could vote 100% for Hamas. I would not accept that argument. The only time I would is if it's 100% of 100% of 100% voting for, and it's all 100% of the voting population. That's when I would accept that argument, although only lightly because you still have children. You still have people that cannot vote. And I looked up the demographics. The demographics on in Palestine are like, oh, I don't have it now. I had it pulled up, but I lost it. It's like 80%? No, I'm sorry, it's not. It was like 40%. I don't know why I got it. It was like 40 some percent were like 0 to 14 years of age. Like there's like 1,800,000 people living in Gaza right now, and there are about 800,000 kids who are somewhere between 0 and 14 years old. Okay. So even if it was 100% of people voting, for Hamas, you still have innocent children that you're killing. And I simply don't accept the idea that we're dealing with humans or we're not dealing with humans. I think that rhetoric is very dangerous because it allows us to say, well, they voted for it when in fact a good majority of the people did not vote for it, or they have not been able to vote again since. And it excludes all those who couldn't vote, right? Because there are going to be children, there are going to be potentially people who were sick and in the hospital, maybe they couldn't vote. There's many people who could not vote in one way or another. And then even after that vote, once the government has become powerful enough, then they can prevent votes and they can, and let's face it, our government here in the US does things that we don't approve of all the time. There's a lot of things. I don't want to be killed because my government did something that I didn't want them to do in the first place. So it shouldn't happen over in Palestine or anywhere. Another, um, and think about it this way. Just want to go back to we're not dealing with humans. They're too vicious. These are actually the people that are committing the atrocities because the civilians who aren't doing these things, the men, the women, the children, they are still human. They are not vicious, at least not yet. But if you kill enough of their family members, they might grow up to be that way. Human shields. It's not Israel's fault. They got, but they're being used as human shields. I mean, think about that for a second. Like, it's not the retaliation, the country that's doing the retaliation. It's not their fault because somebody else is using a human shield. Well, if you know they're using a human shield, that means you're killing people on purpose, knowing that they're being used as a human shield. Like, we're not even talking like the argument isn't even, well, the Palestinians are willfully using themselves to shield Hamas. It is Hamas is using them. So think about that more stateside, more here in the US. Because we've been a long time from war. So we don't really have any good things that we can recall. Would it be acceptable for the police, the FBI, or SWAT teams to kill innocent people who are being used as innocent shields? I mean, I'm sorry, being used as the innocent people that are being used as shields? No, we would not accept that. We would never make that argument. Why? Because it could be our neighbor, our mother, our father, or somebody that we know because it's too close to home. We're really only making this argument because it's far away. And we need to recognize that. And Um, I get it. If you think that it's different because it's a wartime situation, fine. You need to explain why it's different. Why is it different that when it's war, we could kill somebody who's innocent when we wouldn't otherwise accept that? That's a very that's a that is morality that changes, right? Like, and there's a term for it, and I'm just too early in the morning for me to think of the term right now. Um, but this is not this is fundamentally a bad way to approach morality, to suggest that, oh well, in this situation it's different. No, you explain why. I have said it's not acceptable here. It's not acceptable here. So I'm being consistent. So if you want to make the argument that all of a sudden that I need to think of war as different, then you need to explain it. You can't just say, "Oh, well, it's human shield, it's okay." No, I said it's not okay because there are innocent people that are being used against their will. And remember, libertarianism is about self-ownership. There are Palestinians who own themselves but are not making these decisions because, so far as I've been told, nobody has told me that Palestinians are willingly being used as human shields. So, um, here's one. I hate this one. You, funny, I said hate. You hate Israel. I see this all the time. This could probably be the absolute worst criticism that of the anti-war position is that you hate Israel. And they go like when the big deal was Ukraine and Russia, and we were calling for peace, they would say, "Well, you hate Ukraine, and you hate this and in some other country, that where we're at war or where we're at war." It would always be like, you hate soldiers, you hate this, you hate freedom, you hate democracy. Whatever the argument is, whatever is being placed in there is, I hate this. This is probably the worst criticism. And here's why. That is exactly what abusers say. They say that this is emotional manipulation. There is no difference in saying, well, you're just anti-war because you hate Israel. Now, there might be some people like that, right? Most most every anti-war person I know is not that person. They are not somebody that hates Israel because every one of them have said Israel can defend themselves. They can go and shoot Hamas. Like, people that hate Israel would not even allow that much. They would say, "Nope, you just have to take it. It's too bad, blah, blah, blah." So, but abusers use this tactic because they'll say something like they'll be like a man might be abusing his wife, and he might say, "Well, you just don't love me. That's why, you did this thing that made me angry, that made me want to smack you around." Right? Like, this is an abusive argument. And it's probably the worst one. So let people know when they say, well, you just hate Israel. No, actually, I don't hate Israel. Now, if you do, well, then just own up to it. But if you don't, which is probably most people, then let them know. No, it's not that I hate Israel. What it is, I think that Israel should be able to defend themselves. And I think that we should not kill innocent civilians indiscriminately. Um, See, I know I had some clips here. No, I'll get to those later. What a clip. Time was given to flee. I had to think about this one. People are like, well, Israel gave him 24 hours. Now, I've never been to Gaza, so I don't know what the country's like. I've only seen like pictures and videos. Um, but I got to thinking about it and I was like, maybe that time wasn't enough. And here's why. I want you to consider the US. We don't have any equivalent. But this is the best comparison that I was thinking of. And I think it kind of highlights why 24 hours may not have been sufficient. And this is disregarding, the issues that are related to where they can actually exit, where are they going to go. We're talking about just the act, just the ability to move from one location to another. Okay. Here in the US, when Hurricane Irma in 2018 hit Florida, it took people sometimes up to 30 hours to get to safety. Now, to put that into more perspective, if you were traveling on a good day between Miami and Jacksonville, that's basically the bottom of Florida to the top of Florida. It's going to be about a 6 hour drive, somewhere around there, somewhere between 5.5, 6 hour drive, maybe a little bit longer. You got to stop and maybe get some fuel and maybe have a snack. But about 6 hour drive. Okay. Um, Florida is a state in a first world country with first world services where most people have vehicles. And in the midst of fleeing a hurricane, it took some of them almost 30 hours to get to safety. Now, why is that? It's not so much that, like, it's not like if you want to say, well, you're comparing apples to oranges because you're comparing, a potential bombing to or an incoming hurricane. But the reality is, the reason it took people that long is because everybody was trying to leave. Even though we have highways and we have a lot of cars and we've got solid infrastructure here in Florida. But when everybody wanted to leave, all of a sudden you have a lot of congestion. And that congestion makes that just slows things down. The same would apply in Gaza. Now, from reports that I read, people were fleeing on foot. They were like on, I think I saw like on donkey, in cars, in scooters. People in Florida weren't leaving on animals, not that I know of. They were leaving in cars, right? On highways that are built for many, many cars. And even then, we had up to 30 hours to get people to get to safety. And the same thing, you can look at the same concept conceptually in Gaza. When all of a sudden everybody needs to leave, things are going to get congested. And that doesn't even account for, do they have first world level roads? From what I've seen, not so much. Does everybody have a car? From what I've read, not so much. So this makes it even more difficult. Imagine if you're riding a donkey and you're trying to go, even a few miles. Like, it's going to take you a while. And then if there's all kind of congestion and the donkey stops, whatever. Point being, I don't know that 24 hours was enough time. And I don't think it justifies it, to be honest with you. Because again, everything goes back to innocent lives. Everything. Um, Here's another one. This is where people justify the mass death, right? They'll say something like, "Well, we did this in Japan, and look, they've never attacked us again." Let's skip away from the moral arguments for a moment. Let's just address that one because it's actually a pretty stupid argument in the first place. It's what we call resulting. And if you heard one of my past episodes, I talked about resulting being this thing where you base a decision on whether or not you got the good results. So it's the same thing as when somebody says, "Well, I did it and it turned out fine for me, so therefore it must not be harmful. It must not have been a bad idea." I jumped off the roof and I didn't die, so therefore, it was a good idea. No, that's not how good decision making works. This is called resulting by determining based on the result whether or not the action was good. It doesn't address the morality of the situation, which again, in this case, in the case of the bombing of Japan that we did after they attacked Pearl Harbor, that killed many hundreds of thousands of innocent people. And then it also doesn't account for, was there a better option to get the same result? That is how we determine whether or not a decision was good apart from any morality. That's how you determine whether or not a decision was any good, is with the information that you had at the same time. Did you have another option that could have gotten the same result that and by result in this particular case, a country not bombing us again, which is a pretty low bar to begin with. So no, that I think I reject that one. And we're not going to get into the morality of Japan. I think the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was immoral. But if we want to step away even for a moment from the moral issue, you can simply look at it and say it doesn't even make sense as an argument because you're simply saying, well, nothing bad happened again after that. Because like, what if Japan had bombed us again sometime? Then you would have to say, well, I guess it wasn't such a good idea. No, it wouldn't make sense then either. It's a dumb argument. So, dancing Palestinians in 2001. I saw this one come up recently where somebody showed a video and they're like, well, did you see the Palestinians dancing? Yeah, I did see a handful of Palestinians dancing. Now, a lot of people would point out, they would say, well, yeah, did you hear about the dancing Israelis? I don't know that I would do that. That's the whole what about argument. People get kind of feisty about whataboutism, and I don't think people really understand it. It does have a utility, but it tends to be used incorrectly anyway. But ultimately, the fact of the matter is, people that were dancing in 2001, the ones that I saw were all adults. Okay. So again, we still have to deal with the children, and we didn't see children dancing. And even if we had seen children dancing, like let's say we saw a 13-year-old dancing in 2001 after the bombing of the after the attack on the World Trade Center, I would still be like, well, they're children, so children do stupid things, and I'm going to consider the children innocent, maybe not so much the adults. But again, dancing at somebody else's tragedy, well, that's not a crime. That may be poor form, it may be despicable, it's a lot of things, but it is not a crime. And let's face it, every time a celebrity in the US dies, that's somebody who's like known to have sharp political opinions. The other side basically does the dancing Palestinians every time. It doesn't matter who it is. Like remember when Rush Limbaugh died? A lot of people were like, "Oh, they were celebrating." Right? So, if you were in our own country, people were celebrating. I think it's wrong, but that doesn't mean that those people that celebrated somebody else's death or tragedy, that doesn't mean that they get to die 20 years later. It doesn't. That's just a dumb argument. But I've seen them, and I've seen some of the videos where they show some Palestinian kids maybe singing some anti-US or whatever, or saying some things. Again, these are children, and I get it. They're being groomed, if you will. Um, but they are still children. They cannot consent. Which is actually, you know what? That's an interesting point. Let me stop right here on this. If we show a video of children being clearly groomed to an opinion, and that is justification for wiping out all of Gaza, which tends to be from the conservatives, the same people who would say a child who is being groomed in, like, say, the trans community cannot consent. And it's the adults who are wrong, not the kids, and that the kids don't know any better. Like the conservatives are the ones making these arguments, right? And in their own happy community, in their own country, they will make the exact opposite argument. And they will say, oh, well, these kids, they're just being told by adults. We can't trust what the kids say. They don't know any better. They can't consent. Okay. Well, doesn't that apply in Palestine as well? You see a 12-year-old who's chanting anti American stuff, they're being groomed. And you should be opposed to groomers, whether it's sexual grooming or whether it's war grooming. So be consistent, conservatives. How about that? All right, I want to do this last one. This last argument here. Um, this one, I'm gonna put this up on the screen just so that you can see it. And let's see, we're getting close to time here. But we got a few moments. So I'm gonna put this up. This comes from Joe Walsh. I know. Sorry, folks. I'm sorry. Don't be angry at me. So this comes from Joe Walsh. Oh, I got to zoom in again. All right. So we'll zoom in there a little bit. All right. So I'm going to read it out loud. He says, real world problem. You are a sovereign nation. A neighboring country attacks you, targets your civilians, brutally killing and kidnapping them. You must respond. But the problem is, the country that attacked you is ruled by a terror organization that does not value life, not the lives of your people and not the lives of their people. For 16 years, they've used their civilians as human shields. So their civilian and terror infrastructures are virtually one and the same. So I asked the all too familiar chorus of Israel critics, what would you do? Don't just take a shot at Israel. If you're Israel dealing with what Israel must deal with, as spelled out above, what would you do? Now, I'm not a big fan of Joe Walsh. I have plenty of criticism for him, but I think this is a fair ask. This is like he's saying, like, look, don't just criticize. What would your response be? And that's a fair question because if we're going to respond and say, hey, don't do that, we should be prepared to say, what should they do? Right. So here is my I've got like five things that I would do. Now I'm just a guy that's got a podcast. I'm gonna go to work after this. I am not a foreign policy expert. I do not have a lot of the intel that our foreign policy has, that are people that are working in foreign policy have. Okay, so what I would do, number one, I would take whatever responsibility for creating said monster. Now, it's my understanding back in the day. Now, I know there's some arguments about whether or not Israel actually created Hamas, but my understanding is that they supported the creation of Hamas in order to divide the people that they were already fighting with. So I would first and foremost take responsibility for my role in this monster becoming the monster that they are now. Okay, and I don't think that's happened. And that needs to happen because once it does, once you start owning your role in it, all of a sudden you have to start taking more ownership of how you respond to it. You don't just get to respond and kill innocent civilians. Number two, I would remove the gun laws that left people defenseless. There have been a lot of comments where this shows like the Hamas terrorists paragliding in, right? And then people say, "Tell me again why I don't need an AR-15 with 30 rounds." It's exactly true, because if the people had been had they are their own first responders. Now, we can skip the arguments about whether or not Hamas should have been able to make that breach. They did. Okay. It doesn't matter whether they should have been able to or not. They did. And when they did, the people were defenseless because there was whatever time gap. I don't remember, I've heard different numbers, but there was whatever time gap between the time that they got down and by the time that Israel responded. And in that time, the first offenders, as with any time that you're faced with an enemy, the first offender is you. The first offender in this case was the innocent Israeli people who had no firearms to fight back. Now it's possible that maybe they would, if they, it's possible that the invading army has made way too many numbers, right? That's that's fine. I get that, but they were completely defenseless. So I would remove the gun laws and say, look, I mean, you're talking about a conflict between two parties that has existed for many, many years, and you're going to leave people defenseless. I think that's a problem. And I think the government should own that. Number two, I would not bomb the only exit. To my knowledge, the only exit is to Egypt. So when people say, oh, they can just go somewhere else, they literally have to flee south and go down to Egypt. And the story, from my understanding, was that they bombed a tunnel because there's an underground network of tunnels. So they bombed a tunnel that was close to the border. Other people have said, hey, they bombed the actual exit itself. I'm not entirely certain, but they bombed close to it. So I wouldn't bomb that area because if you're telling civilians go over there and then you're bombing close to over there, civilians are going to be smart and not go over there. Number four, I would not cut the services which affect the citizens more so than the terrorist. Okay. They cut the internet, they cut water, they cut all these things. Um, I mean, I get it. This is a time of war and all, but don't you think it's a little weird that they had control over all of that in the first place? That's kind of weird, but we're not going to get into that. They cut all those services. So now you have a population that was given 24 hours to hopefully get out of there, right? Um, and so now you might be creating more people that are got somebody sneaking in. It's all right. Got it. All right. Sorry about that, folks. A little communication here goes a long way. So again, what would I do? What would I have done if I was Israel? I would not do some of these things because these create more problems, right? When you start cutting off the services, they create problems with the citizens, the innocent people who do need that to live. They need water to live. Um, they don't necessarily need internet, but the internet's good because they can let people know what's going on in Palestine so that we have a better picture, so that we know who we should support and what kind of actions we should support. And then I would only bomb where terrorists. I would only bomb the terrorists where civilians are not, and send strike teams where we know there are civilians. Now, again, earlier I mentioned that hey, um, innocent civilians do sometimes die. I get that. The North Star is one innocent life lost, killed is too many. One is one too many. That is the North Star. That is what we always aim for, 100%. If during the course of an action, you believe that there are no civilians in a particular area and you are wrong, that's a different story because you made an effort to not kill civilians. Okay. So to me, the foundation of my anti-war argument is we do not want civilians to die. We do not want to kill innocent civilians. All right. So that's how I would respond to Joe Walsh. Now, let's wrap this up here. I want to wrap this up with something from Dave Smith here. I watched a video of his I recommended. I don't remember the number. Part of the problem, it was the one where he was responding to Yoni Brook. I don't know, some guy named Brook uh, from the Atlas Foundation, I believe. And it was a very good argument, but it was a very good response. But I think this one clip says a lot because a lot of the big argument that people are having is, doesn't Israel have the right to defend themselves? The answer is yes. But I think I'm going to end with Dave Smith pointing out this one point. And it's like literally a 6-second clip. It's a great clip. Here we go.
If you're attacking innocent people, then you're not defending yourself.
That's it. It's that simple, folks. If you are attacking innocent people, you are not defending yourself. It goes whether it's a police action. Hey, little buddy. It goes whether it's a wartime action. Defending yourself is attacking a threat to you. An innocent person is not a threat to you. A person who's dancing because they're happy that you got killed is not a threat to you. They may be a terrible person, but they are not a threat to you. So, those are my arguments. That's how I respond to people. Ultimately, it boils down to just focusing on the fact that innocent people get killed and they should not be. And the way that we prevent them is to aim for peace. So I want to thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Be sure to catch me every morning, Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Eastern, for an informed discussion on politics and culture. And Sundays at 7 p.m. with my co-host, Susan Hogarth, where we discuss LP happenings. We look out across the tyrannical country that we live in, and we find what activists are doing in their local and state Libertarian Party affiliates. And then we report on them to let you know. Be sure to do all the proper audience actions. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. Let's see where we are. There it is. Bam, there we are. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, youtube.libertydad.com. Go over to rumble.libertydad.com and subscribe there. Still a work in progress, so not a lot of action at Rumble just yet. One-man band here, so give me a little bit of time, but it is happening. It's coming. If you want to follow me, go ahead and do it just go to Twitter or X, Liberty Dad Pod on X, and then you can send me an email, libertydadpodcast@gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. If you are remember, if you're a champion of liberty, your business is people, your product is liberty. I want you to have a great week. Catch you tomorrow. But for now,